Welcome to the latest instalment of the SCItalks, the SCI's public lectures. Our subject today is building your digital twin, virtual you. How would a digital twin revolutionise medicine and change your life? For those who are new to SCItalks, you can join the conversation via a Q&A session, which will be after our talk. And yep, as you know, you're muted, you're in listen-only mode, so you can't interact directly, but you can at any time during the presentation type a question into the question box, and I'll be curating the questions at the end of the talk. For those who don't know me, I'm chairing this session. I'm Tim Reynolds. I'm based in Brussels, and I'm chair of the SCI's public evening lecture committee that curate SCItalks. I'm also chair of the SCI's College of Scholars Operational Committee, so we're getting used to that, especially at the AGM and something called the Day of Science Careers, which is coming up at the end of October. It says on my description that I'm an excellent science communicator, but I think it's fair to say I'm not in the same league as our two speakers today. Firstly, Dr. Roger Highfield, who is currently Director of Science at the Science Museum Group, and previously a very well-known science journalist with the Telegraph, and indeed New Scientist. And other co-speaker is Professor Peter Coveney. He's also a well-known science communicator and also Professor of Physical Chemistry at UCL, University College London. And together they've authored, Roger's authored quite a few books, but Peter and Roger have put together, I think, 3 books, Arrow of Time, Frontiers Complexity, and Virtual You, which is the subject of our talk today. Virtual You is a book that was published a few years ago. I think the paperback only came out about a year ago, and it's available at all good bookshops and failing that, Amazon, of course. So the talk is based around the book, and of course, if you want to dive in a little deeper later on, then do think about purchasing it. So over to you, Roger and Peter.
Peter and I have worked together on 3 books, and you can sort of see this as a journey from the cosmic to the personal. We started off with a question of why time moves forward, and we explored how this temporal asymmetry fuels the emergence of complexity in nature and society. And, you know, this journey ends up along the way, we look at the ability to model these systems and really culminating in the creation of digital twins that can mirror our biology in silico. So next slide, thanks. So I know this seems a bit curious, but whenever I think of conventional medicine, this image always swims into my head. You know, when your doctor treats you and takes you on, hopefully, the road to good health, they're constantly sort of looking in the rear view mirror because their treatment choices are driven by what previous trials on people a bit like you suggest might work for you in similar but not identical circumstances. So next slide, please. So the reason that digital twins are exciting is that, first of all, they're already in routine use. You know, digital copies of machines, even factories, are helping to anticipate hurdles, perfect designs, and prevent mistakes. And the hope is that we can do the same for medicine to make it truly personalized and predictive. And I know a lot of people will say, well, hang on, what about AI now? But all I'd say is that if you can train an AI on personal data, then yes, you can achieve a bit of this vision. But often when people talk about AI, they're talking about training it on population data. So you end up with one-size-fits-all insights, which is exactly what we get from conventional medicine. So digital twin vision is much closer to a kind of weather forecast. Think of it like a healthcast, as it were. Next slide. So where was the idea of the digital twin born? A lot of people like to talk about Apollo 13, and here's me with Jim Lovell, who commanded Apollo 13 in the Science Museum. And the potential of digital twins really came to life in response to Apollo 13's oxygen tank explosion. You can see the stricken spacecraft on the right, where NASA used lots of different simulators to evaluate the failure. But there was one digital twin. I'm using the term loosely because actually there was a lot of analog components in there that allowed mission control to really work out how to deal with the disaster without experimenting on the actual spacecraft itself. So next slide, thanks. And here it is. This is the Apollo mission simulator. It's a great behemoth of a machine, and it was used to train all the Apollo astronauts. Buried in that kind of Heath Robinson mess is a complete replica of the command module. And as they tried out various things, you've got different views of the moon and the Earth and so on. And the crew spent something like 80% of their time in the AMS, but it was critical for saving Apollo 13 in terms of figuring out how to power up the spacecraft, how to power it down safely, and so on. So it's a great example of how a twin can actually save lives. Next slide, please. Now, of course, Apollo was complicated, but usually when Peter and I talk about digital twins in medicine, people just say, well, hang on, we're way too complicated. And I've got some of the numbers here that sum up just how complicated you all are. And of course, lurking behind this complexity is the most complex known object of all, which is the human brain. So next slide. But I just want to get over the idea that you don't need a high fidelity, all singing, all dancing model to actually do something useful. Now, just imagine you want to navigate across London. You know, one way to do it would be with the help of a satellite image. And you might think that the more detail, the better. So if you used a military satellite or military GPS or quantum compass, that you can, you know, get more accurately to your destination. Next slide, please. But in fact, you don't need tons of data. You just need stuff that's relevant, such as the London Tube map. You know, and this reminds me of the old joke that all models are wrong, but some are useful. So this just gets over the point that, yeah, we can capture in a digital twin processes right down to the molecular level, but you don't have to do this to come up with something that is useful that can help doctors. Next slide. And of course, as I alluded to, digital twins are already saving lives when it comes to conventional weather forecasting. One of the people we talked to the book was Marcus Covert at Stanford University, who's developed virtual cells. And he always remarks that predictions of storms, you know, days in advance of landfall, and the ability to evacuate residents with plenty of time has saved umpteen lives, lots of property. And it really is one of the great technical triumphs that, in a way, we don't make enough of. Next slide. And of course, there's a lot of digital twins you know, in use already in medicine. So there's lots of virtual drug testing going on, in this case, an anti-cancer drug and its target. Next slide. Here's a virtual breath. This is developed by Dennis Dawley of Imperial and Mariano Vasquez of Barcelona Supercomputing Center. And it shows the kind of accelerations and decelerations of a breath. And you can look at how inhalers work or how pollutants get into lungs. Next slide. And of course, yes, you can do a virtual sneeze as well to look at the transmission of COVID in a closed space like an office and work out just how far the droplets from a sneeze go. Next slide, please. One very familiar example is of using simulations is in the endless simulations of how a virus can spread through the global population. And again, this really came to the fore in COVID, and you know, it was used to work out whether measures like lockdown would be effective and so on. I know some people like to complain about the use of modeling this way, and of course, you can always build in more factors like the economic and even the the mental health aspects of it. But I'd still rather have a computer model that doesn't capture anything rather than the Prime Minister making it up as they go along. Next slide, please. Now, the team of Marco Viccaconti at the Universities of Sheffield and Bologna, they've simulated the muscles and skeleton of a virtual human. In fact, one event I even went to, they animated a virtual skeleton to dance the Macarena. There we are, very useful use of digital twins. But seriously, Marco talked about how predicting the forces expressed by every muscle, can actually be very useful when you're looking at how hip fractures can develop in the elderly, during as a result of osteoporosis, or the forces transmitted in the pelvic floor of a woman in childbirth. So next slide, please. Michel Oyen at Washington University St. Louis has worked with Kristen Myers of Columbia to build models of the uterus and tissues around the fetus. And they've actually looked at the effects of cesareans and shown that this is an unusual vertical cut, and you end up with higher stresses than the horizontal low transverse cut, which is why that's what happens during cesareans. But actually, you can show why this is. Next slide, please. Of course, you can, look at variations in the location of the scar, its more detailed geometry on a patient-specific basis, because if they've had previous cesareans and so on, you can identify if they're at particular risk of a rupture or whatever if you make a cut in a similar place. Next slide, please. If I had to say what's the kind of Everest of digital twins, it would be simulating the brain. Brain, massively complicated, but again, remember that tube map idea. You don't need the whole complexity of the brain to make progress. There's an element of what's called the Human Brain Project, called the Virtual Brain, that's been developed by Victor Jersa in Marseille University. And they're using it in epilepsy, which affects something like 50 million people worldwide. Obviously, you can control this by epilepsy by drugs, but there's quite a few patients, maybe a third, that are drug resistant, and then surgeons have to remove the kind of locus where seizure first emerges. And what you can do is show these connectivity patterns individually of a particular patient, just to help clinicians plan the surgery. And this has been done in a number of hospitals in France, just to make sure that the surgery causes as few side effects as possible. Next slide, thanks. To do these sort of simulations, you often need big computers. So here's a reasonably big one, Mare Nostrum 4. It's probably one of the prettiest supercomputers, Barcelona Supercomputing Center, and it's something like a petaflop. So that's 1 quadrillion, that's a 10 to the power of 15 floating point operations per second. That's something like 1,000 times more powerful than a gaming PC. Next slide, please. And just to show you one of the cool things, this is actually in the Science Museum. This is a bioengineer, Yasmin Aguado Sierra, who used scans of her own heart to customize a virtual heart that functions just like a real heart. And it took something like 9 hours on Mare Nostrum to work through the maths behind this model to forecast her heart's behavior. I think it would take 50 billion years or more if you used, a regular computer. So next, or take a human 50 or more billion years. Next slide, please. And here's a glimpse of some of the things that you can see. The heart beats 100,000 times a day. It's shifting 7,500 liters of oxygen rich blood into 100,000 kilometer blood vessel network. Next slide. You can also show the electrical signals that trigger each heartbeat, and you can test out the effects of a pacemaker. The Barcelona teams used these virtual hearts to test if drugs cause arrhythmias. And in Oxford, Blanca Rodriguez's team has used her model to predict the risk that drugs would cause abnormal heart rhythms. And actually, the accuracy she gets is better than animal tests. So that virtual assay shows that digital twins could actually make us less dependent on vivisection. Next slide, please. And you can produce lots of different views of the heart. So here's one that shows the muscle fibers in Yasmin's heart contract as it beats. Next slide, please. And here's another one where this visualization, each particle represents 400,000 red blood cells. You can see blood sweeping more rapidly through the valves when entering and leaving the heart. And actually, Yasmin could reassure herself she had a healthy heart. I know she was pregnant not so long ago and charted the cardiac changes that took place as a result. I'm looking forward to what that has revealed as well and how the twin would have to be adapted. Next slide, please. And here's another twin in action. This is from Boyce Griffith, the University of North Carolina. And you can see the fluid structure interactions in the heart, and again, to test treatments or test the impact of diseases. Next slide, please. There's a spin-out company from the Barcelona Supercomputing Center, LM, and they've even created personalized digital hearts of the whole staff. And you can imagine a future, where we're testing, that you can do virtual testing on these things, and you can investigate possible, variants on various themes on one particular heart and everything in between. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to hand over to Peter, who is pioneering the use of exascale computers. Alas, we haven't got one in the UK, but over to Peter to tell us more.
Thank you very much indeed, Roger. I hope everyone can hear me. Notify me if that's not the case. So what Roger has now displayed for our delectation is one of these supercomputers called Frontier, the world's first official exascale machine. Exascale means that it can run 10 to the power 18 so-called floating point operations per second. And that machine sits at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, Department of Energy in the USA. And we have access to that. And it may be clear to people from what Roger has shown earlier that in order to run simulations on the scale we're attempting to do, and for the kind of iconic virtual human, an individual, it's the whole human, as it were, from head to toe, and in its full glory from the molecular scale up to the, large macroscopic level. There are huge challenges there. So although medics traditionally don't think very much about large-scale computing, if you're aligned with the way we're thinking, you'll realize these are the most complicated things we have to deal with, like Roger said, for the brain. If we're trying to model and simulate those things to play a role as digital twins, and to do that with some degree of faithfulness or fidelity, we have to use these kinds of resources. And this is an illustration of one of those. I think if we go to the next slide, I can show you how we're looking at the whole human scale using such machines. So Yoon Sung is a Korean woman who died early and gave her body for medical research. And there's a kind of physiological library which is comprised of, or anatomical one, of her from an imaging point of view. And here you can largely see the musculoskeletal outlines, at least in particular the bone structure. But you can also get the vascular structure from that. That's the combination of the arteries and veins in her body, and you can get that by imaging techniques. I think the next slide will probably show what I'm getting at here. So in a slightly caricatured and quasi one-dimensional display on the left, the largest image there is of the vasculature showing the dominant arteries and veins from the head to the toe. The point I'm trying to make here is that we can actually get that personalized image and then run blood flow simulations with it on a machine of that scale. So if there are gaming aficionados, AI aficionados in the audience who love using AI, GPUs for AI purposes, well, this machine itself packs a mere, as it were, 70 or 80,000 GPUs on it. And what I'm saying is we can use all of those in unison to run the pulsatile flow of blood coursing through the arteries and veins of a given individual, such as Yoon Sung. And what can we do with that in terms of understanding the human physiology. On the right, we show a few cases of kind of issues that arise in stroke and aneurysms in different parts of the human body, which are subsets of this vascular system, which are, as it were, more tractable to look at in isolation, and you can take parts of them out and study them, the way the blood is distorted as it flows, if there are aneurysms, the circle of Willis that's responsible for problems developing in stroke patients and that kind of thing. I don't want to go into all the medical aspects of this here. My main interest is trying to convey the fact that at this highest end of supercomputing, we're now able to do these kind of simulations in a high fidelity fashion. So the one image on the right, which I don't think comes up later, shows a human heart. And that is interesting because, as Roger was describing earlier, particularly from our colleagues in the Barcelona Supercomputing Center and their spin-out company called Elem Bio, they have what I regard as the most advanced and computationally powerful patient-specific model of the human heart, which of course does many things. We were looking at, it's got the electromechanical response for the beating of the heart, but it's also then pumping blood around the body. The model of the heart, though, just pumps blood through the aorta. And what I'm trying to convey here is that we can now couple these types of models, both of which are patient-specific, together. And we have done that in a paper that was published within the last year, where we put the heart into the center of the image on the left. And then what have we left with? We've got the cardiovascular system. And if we put the brain in on top as well, then maybe you can see what I'm conveying here. It's the ability to look at the whole human and indeed to start probing interactions between things that are usually discussed and understood in isolation, such as problems in the vasculature, problems in the heart, the brain, and stroke. Whereas in reality, malfunctions in one of them can have cross-negative effects on another. And you're only going to see these things in a kind of holistic way through these sorts of virtual humans that are built up of components already tried and tested, as Roger was showing earlier, in their individual settings to build the full system. Let's go to the next slide. So this is just simply showing back with the vasculature the kind of things that you can simulate on the Frontier system. If you have a pressure visualization, and this one doesn't show a heart coupled to it, but when you have the heart coupled to the vasculature, you've essentially got a closed system where the blood is circulating around, driven by the heart. The flow is pulsatile because there's pressure waves that go through the human body, and the pressure waves also then influence the stress that's imposed on the walls of the blood vessels, which you can also analyze, calculate, and assess through the visualization at the lower end. That's the wall shear stress is known to be correlated with the onset of aneurysms and strokes and so on. So the idea is you get this data ahead of time, can analyze it with a patient before they have already gone into a stroke situation and potentially avert it. Let's go to the next slide. So the picture that we're conjuring up here from everything Roger was talking about and I've been building on for these increasingly complicated forms of physiology and pathology revolves around questions that often crop up. Okay, how are we going to use these tools? Who's going to get access to them? And will this lead to problems of various sorts, commercial exploitation, or people being able to get hold of other people's data and then use these things for not sort of good and ethical purposes? So one of the things that crops up here is how do you get access to this type of capability. And to be sure, at the moment, I'm talking about the world's most powerful supercomputers. This level at which the technology has been developed is certainly not at a stage where it can be accessed by many. It was still trying to hone and develop the technology. But ultimately, what's being envisaged here, and for the smaller models that Roger was alluding to that are digital twins, we can imagine individuals with their own data and models, which are their own property. That's personalized medicine in a serious sense. And what is envisioned here is that each individual can own their own data and, as it were, data vault and virtual human that comes with it. And this is very different from, again, what Roger mentioned at the beginning, where currently AI, artificial intelligence, is trying to solve problems in healthcare, usually on the basis of population data, meaning getting as many data on as many people as possible, and then using other people's data to infer how you would be treated. In such a system, you inevitably intend or need to try to aggregate as much data as possible in one place and then use it for purposes of the kind we're referring to here. Now, that immediately raises security issues, because if you have a breach of security there, you're going to be able to control access to what could be many millions of individuals. If you do what we're talking about with a digital twin, everyone owns their own and they control access to it in the way that suits them, rather like you have your own bank account. Indeed, it's very similar to owning a bank account. Most people have those online. They don't go into banks to get access because they're satisfied in general that the electronic security is sufficient to preserve their hard-earned money. So the same thing is true for your own electronic data for healthcare purposes in general. The similar level of security meets the needs. So if you then imagine the scenarios that Roger was getting at, where we're talking about things like in silico clinical trials in the future, remembering Roger talked to us about some work from Blanca Rodriguez et al., it's already becoming clear that if you do in silico studies using patients' own data to help to test the effects of drugs on them, you get more reliable predictions of, let's say, safety and toxicological impact of new drugs by testing on their virtual data, you can call it their digital twin, than using animal models. So for one thing, we're largely beginning to reduce, if not eliminate and eradicate, the role of animal testing. But beyond that, you can see where this is going, because you can join a virtual clinical trial where you yourself are at no risk of being damaged by the testing of a new drug, because it's being tested on your digital twin rather than yourself. This sometimes leads to interesting questions from people in audiences about, yes, but now you're inflicting pain on the virtual version of yourself and so on, and we can take questions on that later. But fundamentally, it's a completely different model in which individuals are empowered to use their health data as they see fit. We haven't reached that stage, but in the long run, that's what we're talking about here. Let's go to the next slide. And I want to talk briefly about issues that revolve around trustworthiness of computer models. In the modern era, particularly as we listen to AI as it's presented to us, most people tend to have the view, well, they could be very cynical or skeptical or worried about AI, but the assumption that's being made is somehow these systems produce meaningful output that we can rely on, and we can do that without the use of humans in the loop, etc., without questioning whether the output from computers is reliable or trustworthy. And that's what I'm coming to here. And I want to make you think about the questions that apply to AI systems, but also more fundamentally, the limitations of the computer models that we use. Even though we've been extolling them, digital technology and the numbers that are used in digital computers make the models they come up with quite analogous to the difference between a real, you could talk about in the automotive industry, car, or the Lego version of it that you can build from a toy in a Lego toy shop. We know the two things look very similar from a distance, but as you get closer, you have all kinds of rectangular and odd edges. This is exactly what's happening in computers. They are approximating the smoothness of the real world with discrete elements, and they do that using these so-called floating point numbers. So this slide is just to whet your appetite for or recognize the issues that crop up that tend to be completely ignored today when we're dealing with fluids flow. The image sort of shows a breaking wave situation where turbulence is important. Turbulence is related to chaos in the sense that very small changes in initial conditions that you might use to run a simulation can amplify exponentially over time. So two simulations that looked as if they were starting similarly end up diverging. And the question then becomes which is which. This is affecting weather and climate predictions, as Roger mentioned earlier. So there are intriguing issues there that have largely been overlooked, and we've been studying for very simple systems. That's why something called the generalized Bernoulli map is highlighted here. And that is actually showing for a case where the continuum or mathematical solution to the behavior of this dynamical system is known absolutely categorically and correctly. And then you ask, okay, if I put this model or representation on a digital computer, how well does it do? And here, without going into much detail, you're in for a shocking revelation that for certain parameters, in particular, one called beta equals 2 in this map, which only has one parameter and one dimension, the simulation results are not just wrong, they are totally wrong and don't represent the behavior at all. And for other values of the parameter you feed in, the answers don't match particularly well with the known exact results. Now, the problem and the reason why we use computers is most of the time we can't get closed form and exact solutions from mathematics. But the lesson to convey here is, well, if you can't get the simplest system to work on a digital computer accurately, how can you be sure that you're going to get an accurate representation for a much more complicated case? And the details of that are a hot topic and open research area that I'm actively involved in. Let's go to the next slide. So what's lurking behind there is the difference between Lego models and reality. And this Antikythera mechanism that was dug up from antiquity in the bottom of the Aegean Sea is just an example of what was going on in antiquity, where people used what today we would really call analog devices or computers to predict things like the motion of celestial bodies, planets, stars. And they were doing a pretty good job with these. And the point here is those mechanisms, staggeringly accurate, did not use digital technology at all. They were using continuous mechanisms and so on. So the reason why that's interesting today is, one, there may be mistakes generated in digital systems, and two, a point that I want to just emphasize now, which is the energetic consumption of large-scale computers. Maybe we go to the next slide here, just to come to an issue with quantum computing that's relevant to this. But if I can hold you to the issue that exists for AI data centers versus the frontier exascale machine, and then comparing with ourselves, it's this. Today, AI is insatiable in its demand for energy, and data centers are being put together, particularly in North America, but you will have noticed in different countries including Scotland, where there is a bit of a revolt against the idea of these things. So as one of the data centers being planned in Utah is the size of Manhattan, and the energy profile for it is of the order of hundreds of gigawatts. A gigawatt is astronomically large amount of energy. Frontier itself, that supercomputer we use, only in inverted commas uses 20 megawatts, which is like 4 orders of magnitude less energy. And there's no stopping the AI aficionados wanting to use more and more. The point we want to make about ourselves is our brains operate quite effectively and they only use 20 watts. And that shows you a massive discrepancy between analog computing of the sort that goes on in our brain and what's happening in the digital world. So it's an interesting time for people to develop more focus on these analog types of technology, which went out with the advent of the digital computer at the end of World War II. And what I'm just putting in here is an intriguing combination of existing supercomputing, the AI components, and quantum computing to show that there are some interesting directions in which these technologies could be expected to play a role for digital twins. There isn't time here in this presentation to go into all the details, but what we've been able to show, and one of the papers that was published only in April, so it's really hot off the press, is that if you try to use, as people do today, artificial intelligence and machine learning to predict the weather from existing weather patterns, rather than use the conventional simulation methods, they would typically train on a large data set that was run on supercomputers, then learn the patterns, whether it's going to rain or sun, or there will be sunshine, based on a large set of that data. With the benefit that, although it was expensive and time consuming to do the training of the AI, that when it comes up to, let's say, tomorrow's weather, it predicts that pattern instantly in an inferential sense. The computation at that moment takes a negligible amount of time or energy, despite the fact that it consumed a lot to put it together. Now, the thing is that because there's a lot of digital technology in there, and I'm strongly hinting at the fact that not all of those numerical solutions are accurate. If you use AI, you may be compounding the problem. What we actually do here is to enhance or make more reliable the classical or conventional AI predictions of the longer term behavior, let's say of the weather forecast, by introducing something called a quantum prior. And that's where a quantum computing device has been trained on to understand the most intricate aspects of the chaotic behavior of the turbulent flows. And it can do that in an incredibly nice, compressed way. But if you then feed that prior information into the conventional AI, it ends up showing much better predictions. And the picture here on the left is showing an IQM quantum computer integrated into a machine in Germany that we use in a combination. And then the graphics on the right, the most striking thing is comparing what's coming out of the computer in the top row over time versus what you get from conventional computing methodologies in AI, the bottom three. And what's said, this work is quantum plus AI. And just visually, you can see that the second row, which is using the quantum processor, actually makes the predictions with AI much more reliable in the long term. So that's a new departure of bringing these things together. Let's go to the next slide. And this is a nice summary which we drew up for a short article in an MPJ computational medicine, Nature Medicine journal. And in this case, it just shows how one today tries to combine artificial intelligence models with physics-based models in ways that, draws on their complementarity and maximizes the relative strengths, so that the sum of the parts gives you more than you had earlier, as opposed to using the individual bits. So it's a yin and yang thing. and it talks about the difference this slide shows between physics models, which have general capability, mechanistic insights, and interpretability, and are quantifiable in their errors, but take time to generate answers, versus what AI models can do, which is often, as I'm indicating, at least at the point where they're being used, very rapid predictions, but have limitations because they don't actually necessarily reliably understand the science, and we can't interpret their properties. So that's what we call big AI, the combination of AI with physics-based models, making sure AI understands the laws of nature and so on. Maybe the last slide is to come. I want to check. This is the one where I can hand back because it's the latest version of Roger's and my book called Virtual You. Shall I hand back to you now, Tim? Thank you very much.
It's there's a lot going on there and a lot more to come, obviously. So questions. We have one in the box, but I'll ask a question. I mean, I'll take the chairman's privilege of asking an initial question. Obviously, we're talking about if everybody was to be given or have access to a virtual twin. I mean, that implies an incredible amount of computing required. I mean, what is there a physical limit to what could be done or what needs to be done to actually enable that sort of access? And is it going to be quantum computing arriving in reality, or do we need those big data centers to actually give us the virtual?
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is a totally natural question to ask. Part of what I'm getting at there is with the development of the analog technology, that's a way of reducing the energy consumption. And we have to, because what's going on at the moment is unsustainable in the long term. I'm trying to put nuclear power plants in place to support AI technology just isn't sensible in the long term. But that case of data centers is very instructive to answer your question. I did explain that currently the insatiable levels take us up to hundreds of gigawatts. And I also mentioned that at the moment, to get the type of large-scale simulations running, we use machines like Frontier, and that's a mere 20 megawatts. So there's orders of magnitude less being used for physics-based methodologies. The AI aficionados know no limits, and they will just go on building bigger and bigger data centers. And you could easily use a fraction of that energy to deal with this problem. It becomes a question of politics and priorities. Who's prepared to put money in? And you can see there's no stopping AI people by just going to bigger and bigger centers. Why aren't we doing it for healthcare? Because that's not a high priority. And then you've got different countries with different views of this stuff. So there's lots of issues that crop up here.
Well, indeed, and then of course the involvement of some major AI companies in healthcare, in other ways, like Palantir, whatever.
Yes,
yeah.
And in fact, Tim, I should chip in a little bit and remember that Peter's talking about really the most complex models where we're going down to the molecular level. We've got multi-organ systems, but as I was alluding to in my introduction, if you think of that tube map analogy, there could well be very useful, highly simplified models that a GP could run on their PC or a person could run on their own, which will give them a pretty good idea of, diet, lifestyle, whatever, in years to come.
Yeah. Okay. So it's sort of, as you say, that sort of simplification, but also, some technical issues too. We have a probably quite interesting technical question on the old Q&A box at the moment. It's from Brett Galley, and he's asking: is it possible to move from the mHealth apps on mobile devices to full supercomputer type digital twin? I think it's mentioned in references chapter 9 of your book, apparently. I don't know if that's a specific thing.
Well, that one is related to who's got access to these capabilities and technology, right? And the democratization of it is personalized medicine. It's supposed to be for everyone. But will it be? It depends on the cost model and who gets access. But if you take as an example the UK, it's quite instructive because the NHS is really keen on its so-called digital manifestation. And digital may not amount to much compared with a real digital twin at the moment, but already you can see that it doesn't support everyone, and in fact creates divisions in the country. So it's probably true that around 10 to 15% of the UK population don't own mobile phones. And the mobile phone is a central requirement to get into this game. You need to be able to communicate with your digital twin, which will be sitting not necessarily at all on your phone, but some remote center. So if you don't supply the technology that ensures everyone gets access, you're cutting them off at source. Compare that with the place I happen to be going to in the next few days, which is India, which is the most populous country in the world. Are you aware that every single person in India, including beggars, own their own digital phones? It's done by design by the government. So that gives you an indication of what it means to digitalize in a sense where everyone can gain access to things.
Yeah.
The machine on the phone won't typically be running these large computations. But again, as Roger said, and we're indicating, actually with AI applied in the personal sense, the beauty of it is that maybe you've trained up something so it can make immediate inferences to you in your context without even having to do substantial compute, although that's been done somewhere else previously.
That's interesting. I didn't know that was the thing in India. I mean, it is interesting how if people are starting from a different starting point, so to speak, a country that hasn't got the technology of the past, let's say, only the technology of the future. I mean, another issue here is, of course, I mean, I know in the UK, the concept of a digital ID or indeed ID at all, as in carrying a card, is anathema to many people.
Yes.
Whereas in Belgium, if you haven't got a national identity card, then you don't exist as near as damn it. But at the same time, it's the gateway to healthcare and everything, in actual fact.
Yes. So what I was also saying, remember, about the new model we would espouse for individuals owning their own data, that doesn't require us all to have IDs. It is basically saying the security model that exists for our banking is good enough for this, and nobody needs a collective ID to get access to their bank account. It's a very different model from the one that exists today.
Okay, yeah, it's interesting.
A couple of kind of implications of what we talked about. You know, people like to talk about being healthy, and obviously you might look perfectly healthy to them. You might feel healthy, but it could be that your digital twin is telling you that if you carry on your 3 bottles of claret a night habit, that you're not actually going to live as long as you would otherwise do. So it slightly redefines what we mean by being healthy. And of course, if you get these simplified digital twins, you can imagine how you could create thousands of them to explore possible health futures for you, and whether it's different drug regimens or different dietary regimens and so on. So, you know, there's lots of interesting applications of this in coming sort of decade or two.
Yeah. I mean, I actually, there's an example in Peter's part of the talk there with the arterial system and the pressure waves and stress simulation. And a family member recently had a knee operation and actually had a post-operational stroke. And it struck me immediately that if he had a digital twin that could stimulate for him, then the potential issue would have been clear. But it's only discovered through post the operation. So I mean, there's obviously clear practical implications straight away.
Yeah,
that's right. And in fact, you know, one thing we slightly skated over in the talk is, of course, you know, there are things called simulations where, you know, you're feeding in the data and looking into the future. But a true digital twin, there'd be a kind of digital umbilical cord between you and your twin, so it's constantly updated with what's happening to you and so on. And there are also other interesting possibilities because you know, we've talked about mobile phones, but also we're beginning to look at the unstructured or the less structured data you get from a mobile and think about how that can be used by digital twins. And there's a lot of interest in what's called digital phenotypes, where, again, you've just alluded to it, Tim. The way that mental health is treated usually is that you have a crisis, and it's only when you have a crisis do you actually end up getting any medical help at all. And there's a lot of interest in using even something quite simple like the accelerometer in a phone to look at movement patterns and so on, and to try to see whether there's advanced warning of a manic episode or a depressed episode. So doctors can actually do something preemptive before a crisis emerges. So there's lots of interesting ways to knit together other trends in medicine with digital twin research.
No, it's a fascinating subject. So thank you very much, Roger and Peter, for a fascinating talk. Our next SCItalk is in the autumn. Slightly similar topic. What chemists should know about AI and where it will be going, with Zoe Webster from Authentic Innovation, who's had a long career in innovation, technology, and chemical sciences and the chemical industry, in actual fact. And that is on the 23rd of September. I think I may well be sharing that as well. And there'll be a couple other in October and November on a similar trilogy of topics, sort of AI and science in general. For those who are not members, do think about becoming a member of the SCI. It's an interesting organisation. It has a reasonable amount of influence in government currently, with Mr. Greg Clark being our honorary president. It's a good networking opportunity for anyone involved in the chemical sciences, anyone involved in science and industry, interface between business and science. So thank you very much for your attendance, and we hope to see you again in September with the next SCItalk. And thanks again to Peter and Roger for an excellent talk. Thanks.